I am Ikram Ahmed. I'm also part of the Global Learning Center and a member of the Board of Governors. And today is, by some weird sequence of events, I'm here presenting today's speaker, Dr. Chris Fox. He got his PhD from the University of Memphis in 2003 and has been teaching philosophy at public and private universities in Kansas. Currently, he's at WSU. And when he's not getting in trouble, sometimes he plays the music, the bass guitar, and without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Fox.
Well, good evening. Let me get so I can see that I'm seeing on the screen what I need to see on the screen, which is what you're seeing behind me, but I am not seeing, which is that. Oh, no, where is that? Hang on. I have to close Windows, not that window.
There's a share button somewhere in Zoom.
Should be this, but why is it not going to that when I click it?
Where's your Zoom?
Right there. Make it big?
Big.
Okay.
Minimize.
Minimize?
No. Go to more.
Go to more? Okay.
Share. Now we'll find a choice of what you want to show.
Oh, okay.
Where's your PowerPoint?
Right there.
Okay. No, we should go to that.
Isn't it? Is that the right one, or is that two? Actually, it's this. It's that one. It's that one. Yes, it's that one. Sorry. Talk amongst yourselves. But I still am not seeing it on my.
You should see it. Can you
minimize?
Do you want to show it actually?
I want to see it on the board so that I can.
Can you? Let's make it big again. Yeah. Maximize this video. Okay.
This is so awkward. I apologize. I mean, I'm just trying to get this to where I can.
Maybe you need to do a single screen instead of a double screen.
Then. I'm going to let. Okay.
Maybe let me give it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ben here, Wichita Public Library.
To duplicate instead of extend.
Excellent.
Thank you to the professionals.
Excellent. Yes.
All right. So, should we hit Control-Alt-Delete and reset? I want to thank the Global Learning Center for inviting me on fairly short notice to give this presentation. This is actually the second time I'm giving this presentation in this very same space. The first time was, I guess, a month ago on March 29th. And I believe it's aged pretty well. But if anything, we are even deeper into the situation that I describe and try to find some path out of. A lot has been happening, hasn't it? And I speak to you now also, you can see from the camera at the back of the room that there's wind blowing, and so we are under tornado watch as well, and so maybe that also is portentous in some way. But in Kansas, it's just what happens. And so, hello to everybody who's here. Thank you all for coming out and braving this evening. Thank you all to everybody on Zoom who are watching
YouTube TV.
Hello? Oh, my computer spoke to me. And thanks to everybody who will be watching this, because it will be made available after the fact. I will be watching what I say tonight because I'm supposed to go on a plane in about 12 days. Yeah. I mean, this is where we are, isn't it? This is where we are. And I want to take into account where we are as I talk a bit about an intellectual greatest hit of the last 25 years, and I ask what purchase it still has for us now in 2025. And so the title of the piece is No Front, No Rear, Hybrid War is Here, Notes from Hardt and Negri's Empire Toward a Tactics for World War III Warfighters. Charles Merrifield asked me to give this talk, and he asked me for a title, and I gave him that talk, and he said, ooh, sounds scary. We'll see how scary, we'll see how you feel after the fact. So here's my abstract. I'm going to read this out loud. On the intellectual left, the signal event of 2000 was the publication of Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri's Empire, a theoretical analysis that posited two figures in opposition: politically sovereign global capital and the human multitude constituted through and against it. Again, this is published in 2000. Now, 25 years later, we in the United States find the volume being turned up on a third world war that already has been raging for some time. A war which, like their description of empire itself, is hybrid, has no center or periphery, and perceived outside of the usual laws and norms. As we urgently seek some way to respond, it is worth looking back at Hardt and Negri's account of how the multitude resists empire, for cues as to how we ourselves can turn back upon itself the war that is already here. Our interest is not with assessing Hardt and Negri's win-loss record 25 years on, but with highlighting what, from their analysis, can be repurposed for the urgent, immediate situation in which we find ourselves. That's the abstract. So, the tasks I'm setting myself tonight are, well, there's three of them: to check recent social theory against current practice. And by recent social theory, let's say from the 1970s onward, because the theoretical grid that they put together basically draws on a set of authors from Foucault on. Second, to understand what we're seeing now, and how we can understand this both in our individual experience and in the collective representations that we encounter. And the category of collective representation and collective reality and what we experience within media space is fundamental, I think, both to empire and to our current moment. And then also understand where we are and to think about the things that it is possible for us to do in a collective situation that the United States has never faced. And this is our situation of a global war at home. Do you like the graphics, by the way? Yeah, PowerPoint's got some pretty sweet page setups, and so when the pages look bad, it's because I designed them. So here's a classic graphic from the Great War. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? And this is a question that posterity will be asking of every one of us. What did we do while what was happening was happening? What was that? I'm going to assume that there is, and I'm going to assume that there is on the basis of a pretty reliable authority, the philosopher Hans Jonas, who came through the Shoah and who made it out of Germany, and who wrote long after that during the Shoah and during the Holocaust, he had young people asking him, well, should we even reproduce? I mean, is there going to be a future? And he said, of course there is. Of course there is. So I'm putting this on Hans Jonas, that we will assume a future judgment that we will have to live up to, whether it's our immediate progeny or the judgment of history that asks this question of what did you do when this was happening? Okay, so where are we in 2025? Have you seen this phrase, the long 1990s? Well, have you ever seen the phrase, the long 19th century? Okay, so within the academic discourses, the history and historiography, we talk about the long 19th century. When does the long 19th century end? Now, that's one answer, 1914. Gretchen, this is Professor Gretchen. Why 1914?
Because that's, well, World War I.
So when the Great War begins, the long 19th century ends. What's another possible answer? 1919, the Treaty of Versailles. But of course, Marshall Falk says, we have signed, what did he say? That we've not signed a peace treaty, we've signed an armistice. Because World War I was not the last act. So what could you say? Did the 19th century end at Potsdam in 1945? Possibly. And so by that same token, it feels to me like the 1990s really dragged on for a long time. And maybe it's just because I'm old. A 90s person, went to grad school in the 90s, born in 1968. And it seems to me that the cultural moment we've been inhabiting for the last couple of decades has not really moved much beyond the political stalemate in the United States that came about with, President Bill Clinton and his stymieing by Gingrich and a Republican Congress that essentially set in motion the cultural war and the political stalemate that we've been living under for the last 30 or so years. Well, as we all know, on January 20th, the long 1990s ended. I mean, they're even talking about banning porn now, right? We're in serious next level post-war consensus territory. And so when I talk about the long 1990s, it seems to me like we have definitely left behind the whole period that began with Clinton and ended when President Biden left the White House. And so where are we now? We are in 2025, and we are in what the philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari would call deterritorialization. That's part of a triad of terms: to territorialize, to deterritorialize, and to re-territorialize. And we are now currently in a moment of deterritorialization, right, in anticipation of a re-territorialization. And this not just at the national level, but at the global level. And a complete deterritorialization of the brave new capitalist future, global capital, that was described by Hardt and Negri in Empire in 2025. We've left that world behind. So, here's Hardt, Michael Hardt, and Antonio Negri. Negri passed away 2 years ago. He lived a very long life for somebody who spent as much time in Italian prisons as he spent in Italian prisons. Go Tony Negri. So what was the thesis of their book that came out in 2000? It was a juridical book, it was a legal book, it was a political book, it was an economic book, and it was ultimately a communist book, a Marxist book. So their diagnosis was that state sovereignty, and they tell the story of state sovereignty going back to the modern era, was in decline. And with the decline of state sovereignty, you get the ascension of a global network sovereignty, what they called empire, smooth world, right? Think about the EU, right? The creation of a universal currency, the re-territorializing of Europe, right, for access for all Europeans. So their model of capitalism, they look back to Rome. And they used Roman law as a model for the juridical structure of this new emerging global capitalism. So rather than looking to classical liberalism, whether Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, or Rawls, although they do give John Rawls some positive mention in this work, they look back to Rome. Everything was going great on this global capitalist journey. So what happened, right? I mean, it seemed like we were heading for unification, right? It seemed like everything was good. Well, 2016, what was the first hiccup? I am a teacher, yes, I'm asking you a question. Now, he was a hiccup. What was the other big hiccup? Brexit, right? Brexit, which is the reassertion of nationalist identity and nationalist prerogatives against this assimilation to some global imperial capitalist model. And where we find ourselves now, 9 years later, is in a period of nationalist reassertion, right? So China, Russia, and the United States eyeing Greenland, eyeing Canada, eyeing Panama. We are back to the bad old pre-modern world of territorial, or the early modern world, the colonial world of territorial expansion. What happened to this wonderful imperial capitalist smooth world that we were promised? So I want to speak a little bit to that, but then my ultimate goal is to look at their analysis of what changes when you go to global capitalism, and how the way that human beings are formed in that process creates the possibility of pushback, and a possibility of pushback that we ourselves have access to. So I'm just going to read a couple of, what were the lessons learned from Empire? So here's the end of the preface. The book came out in 2000. Here's what they say though, and let's remember back 30-something years, again, our long 1990s. This work they wrote was begun well after the end of the Persian Gulf War, what's that, 1991? And completed well before the beginning of the war in Kosovo, 1994, right? The reader should thus situate the arguments at the midpoint between these two signal events in the construction of empire. And what they mean by the signal events in the construction of empire was the creation of a global consensus about the use of force, and the creation of a global consensus about the use of force, right, in police actions rather than in wars, right? That we're not going to fight big wars anymore. Remember the whole discourse about the end of history, right? We're after the end of history now. What was the guy's name? I can't remember him. I'm blanking. Who was it? It was was it? I can't remember. Fukuyama? Fukuyama. It was Fukuyama, right? The end of history. And then Derrida came back with Spectres of Marx and said, not so fast, Francis. And now even Francis, Fukuyama has withdrawn his thesis about the end of history, right? But it sure seemed like we were on the way to a world order that could manage things, right? We no longer had these catastrophic collisions, right? At least that's what was promised. So that was the end of the 1990s. Here's where we are between Putin, Trump, and Xi Jinping. Empire's geopolitics looked dated. What I think it got right was the biopolitical account of how counter-empire, not juridical, but biopolitical in our bodies, in our dispositions, in our beliefs, and in our thoughts, constituted in the bodies of empire's putative subjects. And what this allows us to think about then is a tactics of resistance as refusal and as exodus. How are we going to fight it? And we're going to fight it by abandoning it. That's just a little brief anticipation. So I'm just going to give you a quick read-through of how empire analyzed this new form of sovereignty that accompanied global capital as it emerges in the 1990s. So here's the new version of capitalist sovereignty. When you talk about capitalism, right, you talk about the period of primitive accumulation, you talk about colonialism, right, then you talk about essentially the post-colonial era. And the post-colonial era issues then in this idea of network sovereignty, right? Where nation states are no longer the main actors. Now, who are the main actors? Well, the main actor, the main political, the main juridical actor is a consensus about the use of force, and a consensus about value, and a consensus about creating a world in which transactions are possible. Network sovereignty. Rather than thinking of an arboreal model, a tree, right, with a trunk and branches and leaves, think instead of a rhizome, which is a good Kansas metaphor, isn't it? Right, a good prairie grass. Because with the prairie grasses, there's no center and there's no periphery. The center is at the periphery and the periphery is at the center. It's a decentralized network. And of course, this is also the model that that the internet follows, right? Having multiple nodes, no one single place that everything is concentrated. That second bullet, or the third bullet point there, capitalism, overflowing state apparatuses designed to arrest flows of people, labor, capital, and information. Capitalism is continually, what did Marx say? Marx and Engels say it's continually revolutionizing the means of production, right? So here's a question for you. What's the ultimate means of production of capitalism? What's the ultimate thing that allows capitalism to do what it's doing?
Accumulation, from capital accumulation.
And Jim, what makes capital accumulation possible?
Profit.
Was that property?
Profit.
Labor.
Labor makes it, right. Labor produces.
Now that's a good Marxist answer, right? That consumption produces production and labor matters more than capital. But I'm going to make this claim. Ready? The ultimate thing that makes accumulation and capitalism possible is actually the state. It is the state. There can be no capitalism without a state. And essentially what happens then in this period of what they call empire is that capitalism begins remaking the state to its own specifications. Not that capital wasn't always influential in the creation of, the body of laws and agencies and regulation and all of that. But that goes to the next level in the 1990s. Or starting in the 1970s, really, right, with the creation of the EU, the common market. You get this gradual overflowing of all these state apparatuses and ultimately their inability to contain the economy. The economy then becomes, right, this hypothesized virtual entity becomes the really deciding factor, and sovereignty has to accommodate it. We get the displacement, therefore, of governance by managerialism. I mean, we're in that 5.0 now, aren't we? I mean, who's running the United States government right now? Freaking Elon Musk, right? And so empire, as capitalism, self-presents as the capitalist order as eternal, natural, and necessary. It's not, of course, it's a construction, right, and it has a history, and it's not outside of history, but the capitalist mythos is always, this is human nature, this is how it works, and you are naive or foolish to assume that there's any other alternatives. And because it's so effective, and because it's so ubiquitous, and so pervasive, I mean, I have the world here now, right? It's very persuasive to be able to have access to everything at any moment. So global rather than national or international. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's no center or periphery. There's no inside or outside. By moving away from this model of the nation state as a stable object toward this notion of network sovereignty or imperial sovereignty, we collapse this idea, right, that there's a center and an outside. And what happens at the outside is very important to what happens in the center. And again, think about Rome, right? Where's the empire? It's everywhere. And an attack on the empire anywhere is an attack on the empire everywhere. And so they took their takeaway here, the political struggles of the 1990s, the LA riots, Tiananmen Square, which again was obviously 1989, and WTO Battle for Seattle, which obviously took place after they wrote the book. Their takeaway here was that these show that local situations and discontents, they quickly morph into direct assaults that strike directly at the heart of the neoliberal political economic order everywhere, right? And what this elicits then is a police response, right? That we have to suppress this, we have to manage this in some way. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about pirates off the coast of Somalia in the Red Sea, whether we're talking about Shining Path guerrillas in Peru, or who we're talking about. All of it is a threat to global order. So this was their version, I guess, of going viral, right? Any struggle anywhere becomes the same struggle everywhere. And this line here about this recognition of the commonality of the struggle, keep Austin weird. Now, you laugh at keep Austin weird. Why do they need to keep Austin weird? Well, because Austin was cool and weird and isn't anymore. And why isn't it? What happened to Austin? People. Well, which ones?
Yeah.
The Californians bringing what? Money, technology. And the problem is that it's not just Austin, right? So I've seen keep Portland weird. In Hong Kong, you know what else I've seen? Keep Wan Chai weird. Wan Chai is the residential neighborhood immediately off Hong Kong Central. Everybody is struggling against the same forces globally, the same forces of appropriation, the same forces of displacement, right? I mean, we are one planet after all. And the same economic squeeze that's happening on this part of it is happening everywhere else as well. And so another implication of this abolition of the idea of the abolition of the idea that there's a center and a periphery is sort of a parody of Marxist solidarity, where in Marxism you say an injury to one is an injury to all, now becomes an attack on capitalism anywhere is an attack on capitalism everywhere, right? And so, gosh, where have we seen this recently? What's that, Ethan?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, national events going, or international events.
But I want to focus on the attack on capitalism. Where have we seen specific capitalism and capitalism emblematized by a specific individual being attacked in multiple sites, including Kansas City, by the way? Tesla dealerships. So much so that attacking a Tesla is now, what, according to Attorney General Bondi, is now a terrorist action, right? Now, you might say their analysis is pretty esoteric, but I think they got this right? That these are attacks on capital, but an attack on capital is now tantamount to an attack on the state and an attack on the world order and the social order. I mentioned also here what just happened with Standing Rock, right? That Enbridge brought us, they won a $660 million judgment against Greenpeace, right? This is about a month ago, 2 months ago, for interfering with their right to do business, an attack on capitalism anywhere is an attack on it everywhere. And all of the stops has to be pulled out to put a stop to this. Okay, so another hallmark of imperial global capitalism is the notion of hybridity and the D word, diversity. Also, what's it?
Also the attack on BDS, on, all over, and universities.
Oh, yes. I'll get through my PowerPoint and we'll have a lot to talk about. So, when we talk about late-stage capitalism, and we talk about post-industrial capitalism, we talk about information-based capitalism, we're really talking about something that's happened over the last 50 or so years. And in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about this, right? All our jobs went to China, and China makes everything. And now if we just tariff our way back into having manufacturing return to the U.S., right, that whole ridiculous discourse. But it's important for us to understand the nature of work and how work changed from industrial to post-industrial capitalism. So this is the transition from Fordism, right, to Toyotism. Fordism is a doctrine, an industrial doctrine of the early 20th century. To try to maximize productivity, workers were analyzed, right, photographed. And to think about those Edward Muybridge photographs, of the people moving, they would analyze dynamics and make people move in very prescribed ways so as to maximize the efficiency of their output, right? And so you had industrial capitalism that tried to mobilize people in this way, right, this sort of top-down regimentation. That evolves in the post-war era into Toyotism, right? And in Toyotism, what's different? It's consumption-driven production, right? It's a more flexible logistical chain, supply chain. It's very different, right, than this top-down Detroit sort of model. And this idea also that, the Model T, what did he say? You could have it in any color as long as it's black. Well, that leaves out all the other market segments that want to have a car that's not black. And in the post-war era, we variegated the possibilities for producing for different segments, right? And so diversity becomes a premium. It comes at a premium when it comes to producing consumer goods, and to recognize certain populations as having needs, and then to be able to adjust industrial production to meet those needs, right? What did we say? I said it a minute ago, right? Capitalism always destroys the means of its own production, right? It's always revolutionizing the means of its production. And this move toward diversity, right? To diversifying the output of products and diversifying the customer bases, right? Think about the black hair products, the African-American hair products aisle at Dillon's. That's a relatively recent thing, right? That you have the recognition of distinctly different groups and diverse groups, and then as an opportunity to be marketed to. And they attain their recognition through the ability to monetize their needs. And so diversity then signifies a softer capitalism, recognizing the needs of specific groups and individuals and making a place for them within capitalist space. Now, you can be cynical about diversity, and I think Hardt and Negri are rightly cynical about diversity because it is still profit motive. But isn't it nice to see yourself represented in the marketplace? Isn't it validating? Nobody's nodding, so I'll just move on to my next slide. And so this gets us to biopolitics. Now, I mentioned Hannah Arendt here, but really biopolitics is a term from Michel Foucault. And this idea, right, that political structures in the modern era become streamlined and invisible by being incorporated into the very growth and perpetuation of our biological existence. Rather than, he says, a levying form of violence, we now have a form of violence that we enforce on ourselves, right, through a culture of surveillance. And we train our bodies in such a way as to facilitate obedience, and by facilitating obedience, to generate more revenue, for us to be less difficult to manage. Education is always biopolitical, isn't it? From Plato onward, every description of education is always, with small children, you start with songs. You start with songs and music and dance and gestures, right? And the reward system kicks in, and they learn how to embed within their bodies these forms of generality that are socially approved of. But in the modern era, if you couple that with our incredible statistical knowledge and our empirical scientific knowledge, we now have a technology of control that goes way beyond the old form, which was the levying violence form, right? I mean, think about the old prison, which is the dungeon, versus the new prison, which is the panopticon. You know, the panopticon. And think about this, you know, the idea that you can see everybody in the jail, but they can't see you, and you can see everybody from one fixed position. And if they know they're being watched, you don't have to watch them. Or if they think they're being watched, you don't have to watch them. They watch themselves. They enforce on themselves this technology of control. Capitalism, obviously, is all about fashioning us biopolitically, isn't it? Getting us to want certain things, right? And presenting those things to us. And Jesus Christ, I mean, this thing, right? Don't we set up right? We get that whole biopolitical control. I mean, it's Pavlov's dog to the nth degree. So the body, therefore, becomes a site of contestation over opposed forces, a vehicle of identity, right? And if a society of control, or if a biopolitical society is really effective, I mean, I think that we see this in 1984 pretty well, right? If it embeds itself really deeply into our bios, we end up fighting ourselves, don't we? We are in conflict, right? And it feels right to want what Big Brother wants, but wrong to want what we want. And so this term micropolitics means the reconstitution of our desires and affects to fit the exigencies of what capital needs for me to want, and therefore also my compliance or refusal. Your body is a site of contestation. This is one of the great things in their analysis, and they take this again from Foucault and from others. And they put it in the context, your body as a site of contestation, in the context of this global, ubiquitous market space of imperial capitalism. Think about gender as an issue of biopolitics, right? When I gave this paper before, I mean, Easton, I said, I really had you in mind, right? Thinking about how, I mean, we're seen, and we see ourselves being seen, and the norms of seeing and being seen that we enforce on ourselves, we have this representational apparatus of a media that produces so many conflicting notions of who we are to be. And these things are all, if we find ourselves caught up in that conflict, we are far less capable of resistance than we otherwise would be, right? To divide and conquer. And so they mention in the book, they actually highlight gender is non-binary, as well as a wider acceptance of non-binary sexual orientations, fluidity, practices of bodily alteration and modification. And going back to the 1990s, I mean, tattoos, right? Tattooing. Before the early 90s, nobody I know knew had tattoos. It was very much a limited social phenomenon. Now they are ubiquitous, right? And what does tattooing do for you? Now, it brands you. This is what my mother always said. She said, you'll never be able to be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you get a tattoo, right? They won't accept you. But what does it say that you have a tattoo? What do you use it for?
To brand yourself.
To brand yourself, right? To identify yourself, to express something about yourself, right? And your body, it's now much more permissible, right? Your body is seen as more your own than it used to be. Think about like cars, too. The first time I saw an art car, I freaked out. You know what I mean by an art car? Why? An art car. Have you ever seen an art car? A car that somebody has decorated as a piece of art and they drive it around? Your car, yeah, well, there's art cars and then there's real art cars, but yes. But that was seen as, I mean, a real attack on a commodity form, wasn't it? I mean, and wasn't tattooing an attack on the body as a commodity form? Wasn't it? Right? You know, or piercings, or body modification, any of those things, none of that was acceptable. That was all relegated to, you know, the margins until about the 1990s. Well, graffiti too, right? Yeah, I mean, you could talk about that, right? What counts as art, which is a secondary discussion here, but this idea that a wider range of expression gets permitted in the post-war era, though permitted to the degree that it's capable of being monetized, right? And somebody is capable of turning it into a profit center. What else about this global network sovereignty? The state of exception. This is a political concept. I'm going to quote here from Carl Schmitt, who was the leading jurist of Weimar-era Germany, and then became the leading jurist of National Socialism. And this is from The State of Exception, his book, Sovereign is He Who Decides the Exception. Schmitt is a famous / notorious critic of liberal democracies, and the critique basically is that they are not able to move fast enough to deal with the exigencies that require a quick decision. And because a quick decision matters more than procedural democracy, therefore we need sovereignty as opposed to democracy. Now, we wanted to banish Schmitt in the post-war era, but of course, this never really goes away. And so Watergate, which was, I mean, we're at the other end of Watergate at this point, right? But this time they got away with it. I mean, we saw the same argument in '73, right? It's not a crime if the president does it. He totally got away with it. Absolutely he did. And so this idea of the state of exception is that there's the law, but then there's a gray area outside the law. And in that gray area outside the law, sovereign is he who decides the exception. This comes, so to think about it in terms of international relations, we haven't had a legal war in a very long time, have we? Instead, we don't have these big set-piece battles, right? Instead, we have police actions, right? Kosovo is a police action. You know, both Iraq wars were not wars. And well, Korea too, right? And, I mean, we're just at our misses in Korea. And that's really, I thought about that, Gretchen, but you're right. I mean, that kind of sets the stage, doesn't it? It really sets the first anticipation of these ongoing conflicts that are off the books. And if they're off the books, they no longer have to be subject to the requirements of representative democracy or the requirements of law. The figure that Hardt and Negri draw on here comes from an Italian philosopher named Giorgio Agamben. And Agamben gets this from Roman law, the figure of homo sacer, the sacred man. There's this weird figure in Roman law, the sacred man who may be killed and yet not sacrificed. This is something provided for within the law of Rome, that there's a person who falls outside the law, right? And their killing is not punishable by the sovereign. They are not in the law, they are not outside the law. They are in the law as somebody who is not protected by the law. And this is a figure written into law. And so this figure of homo sacer then is not just a figure of Roman law. If you accept Hardt and Negri's argument that imperial sovereignty is reconstructing sort of Roman law, then essentially every individual is potentially homo sacer. Now, this seems scary in 2000, and it seems scary as hell now in 2025, with ICE knocking at people's doors. And effectively, they are homo sacer, right? CCOM is a gray zone. For that matter, Guantanamo was a gray zone, right? You get somebody outside the territory of national sovereignty, and you can do anything you want with them, and it's not illegal. Now, again, this sounds very 2025. Hardt and Negri see this already happening in the 90s. You have this contradiction here in the state of exception, that on the one hand, the enemy is reduced into just the, not like the ultimate adversary, but just somebody who we have to send a warship after. Or we just send SEAL Team 6 and take them out, right? We can just, like a fly or like a mosquito, we can just swat them. That's the one hand, but on the other hand, we also have this idea, right, coupled with the notion that there's no center and no periphery, an attack on capital is an attack on capital everywhere, meaning that the enemy is also absolutized, right? That property crimes, like carving your initials in a Tesla, are now almost capital crimes, right? Because there's such a threat. I mean, it's perverse, the fact that these two contradictory movements are joined together, but both things are going on. And again, they see this going on in the 1990s. Think about Kosovo. Think about the Serbs in Kosovo. The enemy absolutized, right, as a threat to the ethical global order. I mean, I supported, personally, taking down the power grid in Serbia in order to get them to the negotiating table. I thought it was a legitimate thing to do. But you can see how the Serbs felt victimized by this, right? And you can see how they felt like they were seen as, you know, both a pest, but also as an absolute threat to global stability.
What about the Bosnian War from 91 to 96 and Rwanda and in your view, how do they fit into this?
I mean, Rwanda is the classic example, right? Because what did you get? You got a multilateral coalition, right, acting on the pretext of a universal norm. And the universal norm here is human rights, right? And so it's not nationalist, it's not national actors, and it's not even regional actors. The UN gets involved, right? Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have got involved, right, in the slaughter of Tutsis by Hutus and the melee on all sides that took place, but the rationale changes because it's no longer a matter of defending the rights of this state against that state. Rather, it's a need to uphold the definition of human rights, because if we don't do it here, the whole global order wavers. You understand? And so I think they would say all the interventions of the 90s, right, whether in the Balkans, whether in East Africa, they all had that same rationale. And that rationale is an imperial political rationale rather than a rationale based in national interests. So let's get to this word then, constitution. It has it's a double sense. On the one hand, a constitution is a document, right? A founding document that sets out parameters, juridical institutions, practices. It's de jure, it's in principle, it's deliberative, slow and overt. But constitution is also a verb. To constitute something and to be constituted, I guess, is a middle voice between active and passive. And they are interested not just in the unwritten constitution of global capitalism, but in the material constitution. And by that we mean the continuous formation and reformation of social forces, both on and off the books. Social forces that are constituted and reconstituted through participation in the market, through work, through desire, through affect, through awareness, through media. I'm thinking here about the effects of the creative destruction by global capitalism, the constant reformation of practices of production and consumption. I mean, Wichita at the moment seems to be undergoing actually a big reconstitution. Think about the intersections, all the older buildings that are getting torn down, right? All the lives that were lived, all those old structures are being replaced by new structures and new venues that will shape subjectivity differently. And that's what they're interested in then, is this idea of how individual subjectivities are being formed through these transforming processes of global capitalism, and not just at the individual level, but fractally. They talk about a global mass subject. And when I say a global mass subject, I mean a plural subject, 8 or so billion of us, right? Where we can see fractally the processes happening at the micro level being reproduced at the macro level. Affects, desires, powers, and thoughts. That is the matrix of how we are constituted as individuals, and it will be those things that offer the possibility of resistance. So, we've kind of already said a lot of this. There's this paradigm shift from international to global. I mean, I don't need to say too much more. We've kind of already covered a lot of this. This last point, though, that the intervention of supranational subjects is legitimated not by right, but by consensus. Think about the Balkans wars, right? Or think about, Rwanda. Did we have a right to go in? No, we had no right to go in, right? But was there an international consensus through the UN and through UNHCR and through... Oh, absolutely, yeah, and that's totally fair. Yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah, I mean, the universalism is always partial as opposed to absolute, but at least there's some attempt to claim that we are acting not just on the basis of national interests, but a global interest. And I want to get to these two simultaneous functions of empire here. On the one hand, it supports the globalization of productive networks and casts a widely inclusive net to envelop all power relations in its world order. Everything is within capital. But also, I mean, I guess that's the carrot, but what's the stick? In order to make this happen, anybody who tries to put themselves outside of capitalism has to be brought back in with force. Here again, think of the Red Sea, think of Somalia, think of piracy generally, right? You've got to swat that. In what way?
The way it was smashed.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, Occupy was a huge threat. And actually, was anybody here in Wichita a part of the Occupy thing that happened? Okay, Charles, so how did the city fathers deal with Occupy?
I think they largely ignored it.
Uh-huh. They benevolently let it go out, didn't they?
Well, the Occupy movement here did not engage in civil disobedience, did not go to the streets. So that's one difference between the Occupy and Wichita.
Now, they could have said it's happening that way elsewhere, so we should clamp down, but they didn't, right?
But
It was.
They did, there was some meetings where individuals were taken out
Yes.
from the meeting. But the Occupy movement here, also had some labor support.
Mm-hmm.
But the Occupy movement was not going into the streets as in New York and other places. So there was less reason for the city to take action.
The fact that, but even though, I would say this though too, I mean, were they as subjects of police surveillance?
I don't know if there was.
Oh, they were. They were.
I don't know, because the people I know who were involved, Russ here was involved, like something like that, I don't. Yeah, and I gotta
He knows
disagree
it
with
works.
you. I gotta disagree with you, Jim. We were on the streets playing.
Yeah, but I mean, in the
Trying to
actual
keep
street.
it cool, you know, we didn't bust anybody's chops, the cops told us to do something, we did.
Right, I mean, we didn't occupy streets. See, some of the Occupy movements occupy
Right,
streets.
right.
So what did the mayor of New York went in with the police to brutally suppress the.
Because you were rebellious slaves who threatened order.
Of course, the mayor's argument was we had to clear the streets of traffic records. That's usually.
So, in summary, the picture that they gave us was at the end of the 1990s, 2000s. So what is coming? Well, what presents itself as this permanent, eternal, necessary order, social, political, economic, right? We've moved beyond war. Wars are now just police actions. And this last line, we sacralized a new power that can legitimately exercise its ethical functions via war, though war is police action, right, through consensus, through the UN. There's a legitimate use of force, and that is to preserve life, to defend human rights. So this then was the world order that they described. This is what they saw coming online in the 1990s. Now, it should sound and feel somewhat familiar, even though here in 2025, we're not there. But even if we table, for now, the definition of network sovereignty and what they thought the trajectory of it was going to be, what can we repurpose from their account of the counterpower that empire engendered? What works for us? What can work for us? And in particular, what of the legacy of the material constitution of empire, how our subjectivities were formed in this emerging global market, the way that it has trained subjectivity, individual, group, and mass, to feel, desire, behave, resist, and organize. What is left over that we can use? Now, the historical precedent is, for them, Christianity. Christianity emerges, right, in North Africa and in the Eastern Mediterranean precisely as a response to empire. Christianity's expansion happens during this period. And, I mean, Constantine doesn't take on Christianity until, 313, I guess. The opposition from Rome actually produces an enormous impetus to new ways of being. As they say, an enormous potential of subjectivity was constructed and consolidated in terms of the prophecy of a world to come. This world sucks. What will the world to come be like? And that got people excited. This new subjectivity offered an absolute alternative to the spirit of imperial right, a new ontological basis What does Jesus say in the Gospels? I have come to set the captives free. Right. And here again we see this triple dynamic of territorializing, deterritorializing, and reterritorializing. The pagan world is deterritorialized and reterritorialized as the Christian world. And the Christian world, in its turn, will be deterritorialized and reterritorialized as the capitalist world. So, their political vision, therefore, is republicanism. And what does republicanism mean? Res publica, meaning to make the people into a thing. Res is thing, publica is people. To govern ourselves. They take their cue in their analysis from the international workers of the world, the WWIIs. One big union. Now, they're suspicious of this, and they're not uncritical of the WWII's legacy, most of all that they didn't sort of leave permanent structures. But this idea that you construct one big union of humanity, I think Woody Guthrie really is, I think, the bard of the international workers of the world, and of this idea of creating a mass subject against mass subjection, right? In response to mass subjection, we see ourselves as one. And they identify with Machiavelli, Spinoza, and Marx and beyond. And Machiavelli gets a very bad rap, by the way. Machiavelli, in The Prince, gives us an account of, right, the princes of these petty city-states in the Italian peninsula, right, and their machinations. And he gives us, which ones succeed and which ones don't. Well, he regards the fact of their success really as sad, because it is premised on the failure of these small republican self-governing communities that cannot withstand, right, despotism. So their questions are, what does it mean to be Republican today in the era of a mass global culture? And as different as 2025 is from 2000, we still are in a mass global culture. What can it mean in postmodern era to take up that antagonistic position, which constituted radically democratic alternatives within modernity? And Spinoza, by the way, how many of you have read any Spinoza? Baruch Spinoza, 17th century Jewish Dutch thinker. Spinoza's story is kind of emblematic, right? I mean, he's excommunicated by the Jewish community, the Marano community in Amsterdam, because he's too heretical. And in fact, he has to lie down in the doorway of the synagogue, and everybody has to step over him. And so he's cast out from the synagogue, right? And so what does he do? Well, he goes and starts a bunch of crap in Amsterdam. And he gets in with all these radical Republicans, right? All these freedom people for whom William of Orange was not free enough. And, I mean, he was the subject of massive political repression. A bunch of his friends were actually killed by an angry mob. Right? Spinoza, actually, the story is, Ed can check me on this, that he goes out and talks to the angry mob on his doorstep and disperses them. Right? And so he's this pissant, right? He's this nobody, he's this non-person. And he constitutes this political vision, right, in the theological political treatise of a democratic, ecumenical, diverse state where everybody can belong. Right? This is the vision. And for that, he is castigated for the next 100 years, and nobody's allowed to read him. Where is the standpoint from which critique can be possible and effective? We can critique all day and not get anything done. How do we do this? They ask, in the passage from modernity to postmodernity, is there still a place from which to launch a critique and construct an alternative? And then they ask this question, well, if we're non-persons and if we're not allowed to speak, can we construct a non-place and realize this concretely as a terrain of postmodern republicanism? Where is this going to be? And right now, this really feels pretty pointed, doesn't it? I mean, we don't control, in Kansas we have a Democratic governor, a Republican supermajority, right? All the agencies are run from one ideological perspective. Where do you make your stand in this kind of a situation? And their answer is from within the lived experience of the global multitude, not within official spaces, but from within our very being. This was a meme here featuring Hardt and Negri a few moments ago. I saw this on Facebook. He writes this: disobedience to authority is one of the most natural and healthy acts. And again, there's Tony Negri, who spent time in Rebbia prison in Rome, 10 years in prison, I think, or maybe 15 years in prison for supposedly being part of the Red Brigade, right, in the assassination of Aldo Moro. So the question to ask is not, the question to ask, and the problem is not the fact that people rebel. The problem is that they don't. What is it in human culture, and what is it in the human psyche that goes along with what it knows to be wrong? If we're talking about trying to identify a site from which to rebel, it can't be a physical site. It has to be from within the subjectivity that's been formed by the practices of global capitalism. And so if we're going to have this new Republican principle, it's going to have to look different. This saying no, this refusal will not work the way it's worked before. Previous modes of resistance were sabotage. Think about the communards in Paris during the revolutions in Paris, right? Setting up their barricades in the streets. Conceptually, that's dialectical. And dialectical means this versus that, right? And once you're into this versus that, you've determined what the outcome will be. It's always going to be some version of this versus that. I mean, if you bring the violence, what's the state going to do? They're going to bring the violence. And you can't win against state violence. But what can you do? And their answer is desertion. You can abdicate. Rather than dialectically opposing a force to overthrow it, take an oblique stance, a diagonal stance. Deny it an easy target. Here we talk about, in the last few months, there's been this discourse about malicious compliance. You heard that phrase? Mm-hmm. Where it's compliance, but only in order to frustrate what is being imposed. Oh, actually, we're in the presence of Ed Emmer, who is a malicious complier in the context of Emporia State University, but we'll say more about that later, or he can say more about that later. Am I still there? Is it all over? Okay. Rather than a direct assault, then, they say battles against empire might be won through subtraction and through defection. There's a line in one of the chapter breaks in Empire where they quote an Italian partisan, and the Italian partisan says, you know, there's enough monuments to the soldiers. We need more monuments to the deserters, right? And desertion doesn't have a place. To desert means to evacuate a place of power, right? To make the person who's imposing that power push against an open door. They give the example of the Eastern Bloc, right? The fall of the wall in 1989 as desertion. I mean, ultimately, right? The troops who were sent to impose the will of various, Eastern Bloc leaders, they deserted their posts and joined those who were rebelling. Think about Ceausescu. And in terms of what leads to the quote-unquote failure of the Soviet Union wasn't a military defeat, it was an economic defeat. Russia could no longer produce. And one of the reasons Russia could no longer produce is that all those who Russia relied on to lead production, to change things, they all left. They deserted. They got out. This mass exodus of trained workers that precipitated the collapse of the wall. In our moment, I don't know what to say about any of this. In our moment, in the last few months, we've seen a desertion. And in particular, we've seen the desertion of the theorists of liberal democracy, Timothy Snyder, Marcy Shore, of Yale University. Actually, they're all of Yale, and Jason Stanley. They've all bugged out of the United States. They're all headed for the University of Toronto. This brain drain increasing. At this point, 50 American researchers have applied after Marseille University in France announced a, quote, safe space for scientists. So desertion works. So that's the molecular side of resistance. The molar side, the big picture, is that we do need some force that's able to organize the destructive capacities of the multitude. This is so, I don't even know what to say. I feel like I should shut up and just like let this all get solved, but they say, I say, we need a force that can construct an alternative through the desires of the multitude. A new global vision, a new way of living in the world. Now, they put this desire for a new way of living in the world, their phrase for this is an anthropological exodus. And they say, the will to be against really needs a body that is incapable of submitting to command. I'll say that again. The will to be against really needs a body that is incapable of submitting to command. If we have talked about the material constitution of subjectivity, right, as our formation through these processes of information and market and the creation of desires, we need to recreate our bodies in such a way as to refuse all of these seductive ways of becoming what they want us to become. They say we need a body, you need a body that is incapable of adapting, and this is great, to family life, factory discipline, regulations of the traditional sex life. Now this sounds very much like what Marx responds to in the manifesto, right? When, so he starts responding to what the bourgeois say, right? And, you communists want to get rid of marriage, and what does Marx say? He says, yeah, you're right to the extent that, bourgeois marriage is really just a system of having wives in common. Yes, we want things to be gone. We want a whole new way of being. They have this line, therefore. If you find your body refusing these normal modes of life, don't despair. Realize your gift, that you're already halfway, more than halfway, toward the kind of resistance that will, because what's resistance going to amount to? It's going to amount to not buying what they're selling. And if you have a body that doesn't want what they're buying, they can't monetize your desire. And if they can't monetize your desire, you are undercutting their political economic hegemony.
You're back on the screen.
Am I? Thank God. I feel so. The most important thing, and this is the most important thing, this new body must be capable of creating new life via art and knowledge. Contemporary capitalism changed the way that it analyzed, let me start the sentence again. Marx's critique focused on one side of the relation for too long, which was the worker side, the making stuff side. But there's another side too, right, which is the consumption side. Contemporary capitalism and global capitalism in particular focused on consumption and the creation of needs, right? Because needs produce production, don't they? It's not that we make things because people want them. It's the wanting that brings these things into existence. And rather than, therefore, having a body that just wants more stuff, they see liberation happening through a body that becomes more human. They call it homo homo, right? Human squared, that creates art and knowledge. And I would say that is a direct challenge to the thing that in the last 3 years has begun to create art and knowledge, which is what? AI. This book is obviously long prior to AI, but I think it anticipates, right, our disempowering at the hands of AI, right? We don't win by becoming less human. We win by taking that back and becoming more human. They say, the infinite paths of the barbarians must form a new mode of life other than global capital. And even, they say, when their lives remain fixed in one geographic location, as is most often the case, their creativity and productivity define corporeal and ontological migration. I lost my job last year, and I got a new job. And the new job required me to teach things that I was completely uncomfortable teaching, namely logic. I had to get over my math fear. Well, you know what? I ontologically migrated and stayed in the same city. And my body took on powers that it didn't have before. I didn't change venues. I changed me. And I think that is emblematic, indicative of the kind of transformation that is possible within our material, subjective constitution. So, just a few last thoughts here. I mean, this is sort of, so there's the cover of the book. Just that last point there, with the last 2 points. The multitude is defined by the will to be against and by a desire for liberation. And that's not any less true in 2025 than it was in 2000, or any less true than it was in 1848, or any less true than it was in 1789, or any less true than it was in 1649, or any less true than it was, you get the picture. We must push through empire to come through the other side. And it seems to me that there is a no going back aspect to empire, to their work, that anticipates where we are right now. And to put a fine point on it, we are not going to be able in this country to go back to the constitutional order that previously existed. We're not going to be able to go back to the federal government that previously existed, because essentially what has happened in the last 3 months is that it has all been lobotomized. That was the express goal of Doge, the express goal of Trump, the express goal of all of them, was to destroy the material constitution, the juridical constitution, the know-how, the mind-body relation of this republic. We're going to have to live with that, and trying to rebuild that is not going to work. Because, let's face it, it wasn't that great anyway. Right? Yeah, we must push forward, we must push through the other side. We don't have the luxury of not. Okay, so, I guess I'm close to my conclusion here. Yes, that was then, this is now. So, how does our situation depart from then? Well, we know our enemies. They're trying to turn the clock back, literally. But we have tasted of hybridity and anthropological exodus, and we don't want to give it up. We're not going to go back. The will to be against finds itself now in a target-rich environment. Bewilderingly target-rich. How do you know where to even freaking begin? There's so much, right? And they are taking everything from us. And they have no plans to stop. It's exactly what Putin's delegation said 2 days ago at the peace talks with Ukraine. You know what they said? They didn't send high-level diplomats, they sent low-level diplomats. And you know what they said? We will never stop. If it takes generations to take your country, we will continue. We are never, ever, ever going to stop. And that is the same thing that is being said by Xi on the mainland with Belt and Road. It is the same thing being said by the Heritage Foundation. And Netanyahu, I mean, it's all part of the same, right? I mean, we're going to take it, and we're not going to stop. So what do you do? What the heck do you do? Start where you are, come together, strategize, and act. These are some exchanges from a Threads account of a person in Ukraine named Margot Gontar, who gave very much the same kind of organizing advice, right, that saw Ukraine through the Maidan rebellion and now is seeing them through war. I won't read all of this, just a couple of things though. Get to know each other, it's important. Learn your strength. Remember, it's your city, your streets. What would you do if you really wanted to govern it? Start doing that, or the closest to it that you can. It could sound silly, but believe me, imagine it's your responsibility. Imagine you have that power already. get on the street for the right cause, and donate and volunteer for causes you believe in. So thinking locally here, some places to start. KIFA, Kansas Interfaith Alliance, Kansas Interfaith Action, Safe Streets Wichita, Defend Democracy ICT, Leading Kansas. These are all organizations that have come together and stepped up over the last few months. And get on Signal. You know what Signal is? It's encrypted communication. It's like text messaging, but it's encrypted. Well, actually, you know what Signal is now. That's what the Heritage Foundation uses to circumvent the law requiring disclosure and records being kept. I mean, they create these tools. Why shouldn't you use them? Because what do we want? We want fully automated gay space communism. Thank you. Well, yeah, I can get that. I will make this available to the PowerPoint, and the video will be available as well. Questions, responses? How about the folks back home? Our Zoom audience? Ben has a question.
I sort of been assuming that, I guess I have to say, if the political pendulum springs back in 2026, 2028, if the, Democrats win the White House, come back, won't there be a rebuilding of the federal government or an effort made to do that? I mean, I don't understand how you push through that. What do they do if they win back the White House? Or what does that look like?
Do you want to answer that? Yeah, your response?
And I'm speaking as someone who I feel like since 2016, I have felt that the Democratic Party is not advocating for unions at all, along with the Republican Party and rights. And what I've seen lately is Democrats in power, and I'm talking about not just people like voters, I'm talking about the politicians, have not at all advocated for unions on the federal stage. And the fact that they're willing to hand that over is a sign to me that they cannot be trusted to fight for the country and for us. I would die on that stand because I truly don't see any momentum in that. Like, I'd like to think that there is a left-wing government that would fight for us, but sadly the reality is we've gotten to such a point that I think the Democrats and Republicans are intertwined when it comes to capital, and like imperialism and capital, the global capital. Like a lot of them are tied by the same lobbies, they're tied, they're so interconnected and they have the same friends, they have the same groups of people. And that's more on the interpersonal aspect, but
it's the duopoly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when Republicans push to such an extreme, liberals don't have the same ability to push to the same extreme counter. And because of that nature, that they have nothing to bring themselves on, there is no power for them to push and govern. And that's a really scary reality that is quite common in empire. I mean, Rome, the same thing occurred. I mean, like when you have an ideology that takes over, it is basically impossible without the collapse of the whole system for another party to take it back. You know.
So, the discussions, over the last few years about a constitutional convention have all been happening from the side of the right, right? And so, you need a certain critical mass of the 2/3 of the states to approve a constitutional convention, right? And so the question, so the state governments have been trending. I mean, the Republicans have been very clear that they're, targeting state governments for the last few generations, and Democrats have ceded that. And maybe one thing to think about is trying to reclaim that discussion And I think, and I'll be very sort of cynical, I think the Constitution is dead at this point, like really dead. And I don't see that winning an election, or even a number of elections, is going to be sufficient to resurrect that juridical structure. Because the breaches of the Constitution that we've seen are fatal breaches. I don't see how you come back from essentially a treason by 30% of the population and a minority of the population overturning the basic tenets. Now, I'm not going to try to answer the question of what you do or what happens next. I don't think they said that. I don't think they're answering that question either. But they're answering the question of where do you start from? You can't answer what's going to happen in history. You don't know, right? I can't see around the corner. But you can ask yourself, where can I start from? And what is a real thing that I can start from? And the way that we've been constituted as social, as moral, as gendered, as critical, those are real, tangible affects and powers that we have as individuals. And if there is a way forward, it has to be through deploying those. You know, you understand? I mean, there's that double sense of Constitution, right? Constitution as a document, as a juridical agreement, and then there's Constitution as the way that we are. And the way that we are is not the same material Constitution that we had 249 years ago. We subjectively, at a species being level, to use a Marxist term, are different. And any Constitution, first sense, written document, that we try to innovate now is going to have to take into account our Constitution, social way of being now. And I think it may be that our strongest power, and at least the power that you start from, is this power of refusal. And not just to say no, but to say hell no, or F no, right? Just to refuse. And not necessarily to refuse in the way that the marcher in Tiananmen Square did in 1989, standing in front of that column of tanks, but to refuse nonetheless, to not show up, to not play along. They only do this, and they can only make this happen because we're paying our taxes. For example, I'm not going to tell you not to pay your taxes, but there's a lot of ways to resist, and there's a lot of ways to refuse. Somebody else made the point, well, you know, maybe when they're getting ready to fly some people out of the airport, you know, a multitude of us can just decide that it's a good time to drive to the airport and make it impossible for that bus to get through, right? I can't say, nobody can say what the next Constitution looks like, but you can say that whatever it looks like has to look like us, and if it doesn't look like us, then it's not acceptable. You get to say no. Now, what are the penalties for saying no? Well, you might get killed, that's true. You might get sent to CCOM, that's totally true. But they can't send 200 million people to CCOM. They can scare you. They can intimidate you. They sure can. But you can still push back. And the thing is that they're terrified of your resistance. They're completely terrified of anybody saying no to them. They're terrified of being identified because they know perfectly well what they are. Can I show you a picture from yesterday? Let's see, where is it? Oh, screen sharing has stopped. Oh, there he is. So there's my friend from yesterday. This was downtown. This person was trying to bait people into going on camera and saying that 86-47 means killing Donald Trump, which it doesn't. It just means get rid of the president. And I called him out. I said, you're trying to incite people. You're trying, because he's live streaming, he's got his camera. And so we made friends. And he was terrified. When the cops came, they came for him and not for me. And after screaming in the square to the 300 people who were there that this guy was out to make us look bad, nobody would talk to him. So he slunk off. So I think, you can take the lessons where you want them, but we know, we've been through this before. We've been through this before in recent modern history, and we keep going through it again and again. But if we take seriously that idea of Constitution, we the people, we the one big union. How do we arrive at consensus? I don't know. But we don't necessarily have to know in advance. And the whole thing sucks. My dad's 85. He says, I don't want to see a constitutional convention. I want back what we had. He may not see it in his lifetime. I might not see it in my lifetime.
So we're in a post-constitutional stage of this.
We clearly are at this point. There is no law at this point. Let's just say that. There is no law at this point.
Complete gray area.
Yeah, we are all in a state of exception.
You mentioned this recently, trying to ban pornography, but on part of that, a lot of the kind of push that trans people count as well.
Exactly.
So by pushing that, it would mean like me online would be seen as sexual.
Yep.
And I would be banned from even having a voice online.
Yep.
That is what they're planning.
Yes.
Like, it's just stuff like that.
Even just same-sex hand-holding
Oh, yeah.
is supposed to be classified as pornography.
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, I was just saying, we have had multiple times in the past when we've been at a stage of crisis, and we've had, I'm thinking, when you talked about being at the airport, the problem is that Americans historically will maybe make that initial step, like the 1850 fugitive slave law, which was the most egregious law probably ever passed up until the present.
Right.
Where the federal agents are rewarded by twice as much money if they send somebody into slavery.
Yep.
They can't show their papers to show that they are free, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It takes just two white men to say you're a slave to be sent into slavery. And so like in Boston and then 5 states passed laws against enforcing that. And in Boston, when they came to get Anthony Brown, people surged the courthouse, but they didn't do anything more. They surged in a huge mob outside the courthouse. But the federal agents still took Anthony Brown south.
Right.
And enslaved him.
Right.
And so, I think there's a way in which we have to find a new definition of nonviolent resistance. We have a new commitment to nonviolent resistance, so that we do more like what the women legislators did in New Jersey. Putting their bodies right up against the ICE agents. Where you actually physically prevent somebody from doing something without using violence, just by your physical presence, We have to maybe find new ways to train folks.
There's a distinction between violence and force.
I think
Yes.
that's
Right.
an interesting conversation of how we see violence. I think Capital for the longest time has convinced us that farming property is violent. To me, that is part of resistance right now.
Yeah, but that violence is exactly what they want.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
come down with a massive response.
Yeah. I
So
think,
we have to find a way to mobilize massive numbers of people.
yeah.
And to be able to have the information, what we're missing now is when are those ICE agents here in Wichita?
Right.
When are they here?
Right, and they're hard to find.
Where do we know to go? When do we know to go? Do we have the network?
They're hard to find, and I've tried.
Yeah.
Do what?
They're hard to find, and I've tried. Now, the ICE director for this region is actually on LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, the career network. Yeah, on LinkedIn. Shh, I didn't say that. But none of the rest of them were. And on Threads, the attempts to collate those names have actually been blocked. Right? Oh yeah, this is, yeah, yeah, of course they have. Of course they have.
We have lots of examples to inspire us, too. We have the women 9 months protesting 5 days a week in front of the White House during World War I. You know, and being arrested, sent to prison, started a hunger strike, you know, to get a federal amendment to allow women the right to vote. I mean, that's a phenomenal thing.
It is, and you say also, that was a century's effort, right? That was 100-year, that was a long, long, long march. And I think we have to get used to the idea that all of this is going to be a long, long, long march, because they're not stopping.
I might say that we will.
It wasn't a century. 1848 was the first time there was a proposal that women vote. This was 1917.
Well, okay, so suffrage was it 1920 though, right?
Yeah, but it was, I mean, 1917, during the war,
Yeah.
that they did this 9 months protest after the U.S. went into the war.
Now, you clearly know the history better than I do, but I am going to say, I just have a feeling that probably even prior, because it was, yeah, there was where was that first?
Very small movement earlier. I mean,
Yeah.
But there were hundreds of people in the jail, right?
in that,
Hundreds of Mr. Prison during World War I.
So we're talking
Not only
decades.
the war, including deaths,
Yeah, right.
but a lot of other people.
What were you going to say, Steve?
Oh, I was gonna say that. I guess I would love that to be true in a sense, but I feel like we've reached a point where our own government does not see us the way we used to see ourselves back then. Where seeing public women being treated like that was enough for people to get riled. That's the money they overpass. Now I think my government gives a fuck if they kill me. You know, like, that is the reality we live in, that I don't think I can't convince a government who doesn't care about me to vote for me or to do something for me, I guess, is that what?
Yeah, there's no shame here, right? I mean, part of what made Satyagraha work in Gandhi was that you could still shame the British Empire. I don't think you can shame, well, you can't shame them. You can't shame the Christian nationalists, because they actually want genocide. Let's just say it. They want genocide.
There's a quote from Malcolm X where it's just like, nonviolence assumes that your oppressor has a conscience about it. There is an assumption that people care, but if they don't, then your nonviolence doesn't mean anything.
Well, the nonviolence,
pretty strategic.
you're not, trying to convince the rulers to do it, it's the consensus of the population. I think, you know, so it's still worthwhile, I mean, you know, you're not
I'm not saying it's not worthwhile. I'm just saying it might not be as effective as it was in our past.
well, the exact same tactics are not gonna be as effective,
Right.
but we have to strategize them.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, nonviolence doesn't mean non-powerful. And if our agency has been reduced to that of being a consumer of not just, you know, physical things, but virtual things, denying them that audience both demonetizes it, but also we regain the affects that we lost by participating in the thing that we were being given to participate in. We get ourselves back in some way by withdrawing our participation and our tacit consent.
There is a fairly sizable, I don't know what you call it, black market, but I'm thinking of my daughter, who lives here in Wichita, who participates in a kind of, well, she's not political. You know, she's really not very political at all. But she participates in below the surface trading of goods, you know,
Off the books, yeah.
keeping her money from the tax structure. I shouldn't say that.
You shouldn't say any, we get the idea, yes.
No, but I mean, she finds ways.
Off the grid, let's say.
I'm just finishing with this newsletter here, watching this dipshit give a presentation over at the UU Church.
I think there are a lot of people doing that.
No. I was gonna see if you could bring me some chips and a sandwich, an ice cream sandwich.
So somebody just mentioned that they were watching some dipshit give a presentation at the UU Church. Hi, I'm the dipshit. Wow, that's interesting. So I'm guessing yeah, let's see. Oh, let's see. That's a good point. Although managing this is,
In the little,
blue one, the second to right.
the little window at the top, you can maximize.
Maximize the window first, maybe you'll find it too. Just don't get it.
Yeah, maximize that. And then there's
oh, I see a chat. Okay. This is a productive question, Catherine. I was hoping somebody would talk a bunch of smack to me, but okay. Aside from Empire, can I post a recommended book list when you have an opportunity? Wow, okay, so, I mean, what are the obvious books to talk about at this moment? So, I mean, there's a sequel to Empire, which is Multitude, which is about democracy, war and democracy in the age of empire. What else are people reading that is in the ambit of this? I mean, I think we could talk about, oh, what's his name? I'm tired and it's late. The lessons from the 20th century. Tim Snyder's book, what's it called? On Tyranny. You could read On Tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. What else? What else are people reading that is?
The new Naomi Klein.
Oh yeah, what's it called?
I forget that title.
Yeah, the Naomi Klein.
The latest, it's brand new. No, it's since Alabama.
There's a number of books on U.S. empire in recent years. I can't remember the names, I've got trouble with things, but there's a bunch of them. One written by anthropologists on U.S. military bases. In the last decade, there's been a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of discourse. I mean, I guess maybe what you're looking for, Catherine, is about the discourse. And actually, I know who you are. I know who this person is. You're looking for discourse of resistance kind of books, right? And I mean, what can I say here? I don't know that you can get a programmatic book about resistance at this moment, right? Because it seems to me like academic studies of how we got to where we are really helpful and really interesting. But when it comes to actions and when it comes to organizing, I think you can read enough, and at some point you have to stop reading and just get moving. But I don't know that I can say any more than that, other than the books we've already suggested. Yeah?
Back in the presentation,
Sure.
there was the word art and the word knowledge.
Yeah.
I'm very active in the world of art.
Yeah.
As a poet with 17 books. I feel like that's one form of my resistance.
Sure. Yes.
And anybody that's reading those books, then we are creating a community. And that community can get together and be active in really, I mean, one of the things that Empire does not like is free thinking and writing and poetry and painting, because they don't understand it, and they don't want it around.
Unless you want to market it.
Unless you.
You have to. It becomes a brand, right? I mean, something that is a commodity. They want it under the commodity form. They like it. Anything that's not the commodity form, why are you wasting your time with that?
There's a guy, I've read his stuff, I've seen him talk, but he's written some stuff, a guy named Daniel Hunter, Ways to Be Prepared Now that Trump has won. And they're interesting. Yeah.
What about just going back to some of the classic nonviolent texts and looking for cues about moving forward, kind of a historical.
So my summer, so I actually finished a cool article that just showed up in my Facebook feed, dated this year about a recent history of asymmetric warfare, right? And I think that I'm less interested in sort of going back through, King and Gandhi, and I want to sort of say, I want to look at the violent resistance, right? The Malcolm X, because there's that whole discourse, do you go with Malcolm or Martin, right? Classic. They're saying two different things. Well, they weren't really saying two different things. But I think that the deeper sort of question of how you do conflict really underlies the question of violence or nonviolence. We have conflict. We're going to have to do something. And so how do you do that, regardless of what tactics you employ, right? And so I think what's my summer going to be? I think my summer is going to be von Clausewitz, right, on war, right, war is politics by other means. I'll read my Sun Tzu, right, Art of War. I think for me, that's the kind of thinking because I want to win. I want to freaking win. I don't want to lose. Because if we lose, well, then I die, and people like me die in the millions. We know what they want, folks. They haven't been shy about it. You know, this is who they are. This is who they are, and they've been very clear about what they think needs to happen. And they have been utterly ruthless in pursuing the means to make it happen. So, me personally, I'm getting serious. And I think this is, politics is too serious to leave to the professionals. Business is too serious to leave to the professionals. I mean, I am interested in how you win conflicts at this point. And I think that that's not a discourse on the left that people are very comfortable with. Because, of the assimilation of conflict to national, state, colonial violence over the last 5 centuries. But, you need to think about and you need to look at how subaltern movements decolonized. And the way that they decolonized, the means of decolonization were not acceptable to people who eschew force. But you know what? I think you can figure out what I think, and I'm not going to say any more. But those are the things that I'm reading and thinking about how you convert those lessons into, so what is Cloyster, Ron Cloyster that says war is politics by other means, right? War is politics by other means. That means politics, ultimately I think politics is ontological, right? Because it's about being, it's about force, it's about some fundamental thing that is operating. And I know there's a lot of discomfort with making the philosophical elaboration of reality have violence, internal to it, or that it has to be about conflict. I know there's a lot of reasons to morally object to that, but I also think there's a lot of lessons in our collective experience about how we engage in conflict, and we can't absolve ourselves of those lessons if we want to not be the victims.
Conflict, the political systems and constitutional systems were set up to resolve conflict peacefully.
Oh, yeah.
Now, if groups can't resolve it peacefully, then that leads to civil war or armed insurrection. But normally, conflict, and there's conflicting interests in the United States and everywhere. There are different interests people have.
Right.
And generally, they've got resolved peacefully through elections, court actions.
Well, except that they don't.
But they get resolved without violence.
Well,
I understand fundamentally they're not resolved in favor of one group.
the
system sort of favors one block over the other.
I just think that, I look at American history as 400 years of violence with episodic outbreaks of peace. And let me finish. And those episodic outbreaks of peace are precisely what you say, right? That this is managed conflict through political means or through juridical means. When those things break down, what do you do?
One reason socialists in the 1890s rejected the violence is their conclusion was the working class doesn't like violence.
Yeah.
They don't want to be outlaws.
Are you telling me this is it?
Well, people don't like violence. They prefer, I think, to resolve without force. But if necessary, they'll use force.
I think it's also really important to think internationally because we need to be, the interests are international in stopping this.
Well, they're global, right?
They're global, yes.
Yes. They absolutely are. And this idea that...
So, if we don't have those contacts, we need to make them because they're, and we need to work with them. That's a huge area that needs to be tapped. In our own...
I framed this whole thing, right, as global wars here. And the conflict that we are experiencing here is not a civil American conflict. This is the global war. And it's the global war of what can you call it? Autocracy versus, they've said autocracy versus democracy. That's maybe not a perfect label, but it's not a bad one, because I look at I look at the options and I look at the alternatives, and this seems to be pretty stark, and it's here. And it's the same here on this continent as on the continent across the Atlantic, and it's the same on the continent across the Pacific as it is here. So, I mean, I know it's the same continent across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, but still, you get the idea.
Can I ask a question here?
You may ask a question. Who is that? Is that Chase Billingham?
Yes, Chase. Hi.
Hi, Chase.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there, and I don't want to interrupt the people in the room if someone else is speaking.
No, please.
So we're talking about Empire, which is a book that was written a quarter century ago, and a lot of the examples that you're citing are from the 90s, end of the 20th century. We're talking about the Balkans, we're talking about Rwanda, and Empire existed. We're talking about the Empire versus multitude in that era, and still at that moment, we're participating in American democracy and anticipating the possibility of democratic action of having some sort of remedial impact. At this moment, you seem skeptical about that, and I'm wondering about the degree to which we should continue participating in this democracy. Should people keep voting? Should people keep protesting? Should people keep participating in this democracy as if it exists and that we can oust regressive forces from power, or is that all in the past now?
As if it ever existed. I mean, you could respond to me by saying, well, our elections have always been imperfect. They've always been manipulated. We've always had the electeds choosing the electorate. That's all true. And our democratic history is not a great illustrious history by any means. But I do think, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, I go at protest every week. I've never missed an election, or maybe one. I think I missed one special election once, and I'm 57 years old. I'm not about to stop now. But I also recognize that, well, I've been deeply suspicious about electoral outcomes in this country for at least 25 years. I was alive in 2000. I saw that election get stolen. I know that Al Gore actually got several thousand, actually 30,000 more votes in Florida than George Bush did, but they were overvotes. And according to the Florida Constitution, you can count overvotes, but the United States Supreme Court overruled the Florida Constitution and handed the election by 537 ballots to George Bush. I know who got more votes in that election. So I'm deeply suspicious, and I'm deeply suspicious of the bad actors who are currently in charge of the entire federal government and the entire enforcement apparatus for elections. And the federal judiciary. Although I will say, Chase, that the pushback from the federal judiciary at both the appellate and circuit court and then at the Supreme Court level, I mean, maybe I've given up the ghost prematurely here, and I'm happy to be wrong when I'm wrong. But I think that having an inside-outside strategy has served the authoritarian right very well. And I think that the left in the United States has had only an inside strategy, and that really since the new left, almost not at all. And for that matter, I mean, you know, the use of the federal law enforcement to dissemble the outside left, it was very effective for 2 generations. How that outside left strategy reconstitutes itself, that's a question for people who are involved to decide for themselves. I vote in every election. I am a registered member of a political party. I will continue to participate in these systems, but in the awareness that we are living in an age of nullification, and that those democratic apparatuses have been sidelined. I will not stop participating in them, but they will not be, I mean, they'll be necessary, but they won't be sufficient for my political participation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Anybody else? Are we good?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris Fox. That was a great way to end this year of Global Learning Center's activities. This was the last presentation, monthly presentation. We'll take a little break over the summer, and I think our next event will be in August. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be still in a state where we can keep talking about these things. So, and we'll be back. They will let you in from your overseas trip. So, with that, I say goodbye. Good night. Thank you. Those online, good night.
Thank you, Ikram.
Thank you.